A little while back, I was having a conversation with another creator about combo decks, and that conversation went something like this. I don't know that I'd consider combo an archetype. What would you consider it then? What broader category does it belong to? I don't know. A finisher? A thing a deck can do? On a somewhat related note, last year on a podcast I was ranking archetypes in Commander, and I said I don't think the Reanimator archetype is one that's likely to feel good in Commander. Down in the comments, there was a chorus of people lightly pushing back, saying something to the effect of, "But Snail, graveyard decks are fun. I love my Savine's Reclamation." This is interesting to me because I don't consider Savine's Rec a Reanimator card. A nice little utility spell for graveyard decks? Yes. A card played in proper Reanimator decks? No. That phrase proper might begin to elucidate the issue, though. I'm saying a phrase, and it turns out that my definition of that phrase differs from a lot of other people's definition. Let's go back to the combo example. What do I think about the statement that combo isn't an archetype, it's just a thing that some decks do? Well, in the context of Commander, it's a pretty reasonable assertion. Combos are a pretty common way of finishing off opponents in mid to high power EDH games, so trying to categorize them as an archetype feels a little tricky. Is every deck that wins with a combo sometimes a combo deck? If not, where is the line on what constitutes a combo deck? What percentage of games need to be won using a combo? What amount of deck space dedicated to pulling off the combo? It's a messy thing to try and properly quantify. So, why do I and so many other players think of combo as an archetype? Put simply, it's because Commander inherits a lot of cultural signifiers from 60-card formats, and combo is more of a well-defined archetype there. In most 20-life 1v1 formats, combos aren't actually the best way to close out a game most of the time. This is particularly true for ones that feature higher-powered interaction, and we can see this in the most popular win cons in Legacy and Vintage: Vengevine, Glaring Fleshraker, Psychic Frog, White Plume Adventurer. These are simply extremely efficient creatures rather than being part of an A plus B infinite combo. The reason for this is simple. It's just not necessary to use an infinite combo to kill a single 20 health opponent on a normal timeline. You'd be cracking eggs with a sledgehammer. For this reason, combo decks are generally a more specific thing, decks whose game plan centers around executing a combo because it offers some advantage in speed, or strengths in some specific matchups. Not all decks that win with combos would be widely considered combo decks. Some might be a control deck that uses a combo as a compact finisher, but the Venn diagram is close enough to a circle that these things are often viewed as one and the same. If you win with a combo, you're probably playing a combo deck, and vice versa. This, once again, contrasts with the Commander format, where combos are frequently the best way to close out games in a wide variety of different decks. And, the more I thought about it, the more I found myself agreeing with Commander Balmy. Combo isn't really an archetype, it's just a type of finisher, a thing that some decks do. This is paralleled when we think about Reanimator. The point of confusion between myself and the YouTube commenters was that when I think of Reanimator, I first and foremost think of the archetype as seen in Modern or Legacy. This is a very specific type of deck where the goal is to dump a horrifying threat into the graveyard through an entomb or discard effect, and then use a reanimation spell to bring it back out into play as early as turn 2. The threats used for this are typically either massive value sources like Grizzlebrand, or oppressive bombs like Archon of Cruelty, and the goal of the deck is to capitalize on the massive tempo swing of a big threat coming down early in order to snowball into a win. As I said in the podcast episode, I don't think this strategy is a very good idea to replicate in EDH. Trying to snowball a turn 2 or 3 threat into a win seems very likely to result in simply getting pummeled by the table, unless the threat is something so disgustingly oppressive that it mostly removes the ability of opponents to play the game, a la Jingataxius or Void Winnower. A deck that has some strong follow-up options might work, but the purest versions of the play pattern are likely to either result in pathetic failure or a generational pub stomp. The vibes are bad. However, the commenters on that episode weren't thinking of what I was thinking of about Reanimator. They were thinking about the act of reanimation. Actual Reanimator decks don't really exist in EDH due to the reasons I just laid out. So, when EDH players hear the Reanimator archetype, they think about a general graveyard deck that reanimates things here or there. In other words, reanimation as a thing that some decks do. And I can't even say they're wrong for that, because in practice, that's basically all Reanimator is within the EDH format. This pattern continues onto other so-called archetypes. Take control. I have an idea of what control means to me, various other people have an idea of what control means to them, but when you get into the broader image of it in the EDH community, it mostly comes down to two things: counterspells and board wipes. If a deck board wipes every turn or two, or counters multiple spells a turn cycle, that's a control deck. Think Baral, Child of Alara, that sort of thing. I also see this whenever I do deck reviews. I start digging into a deck that somebody has labeled a control deck, and it's a massive pile of removal and counterspells. Now, unlike Reanimator or Combo, I do think control decks meaningfully exist in EDH, and they can actually look relatively healthy within the broader ecosystem. The most prominent feature of a control deck to me is a multi-card engine that repeats effects that generate value or deal with opposing permanents. Flickering is a common way of facilitating this, as are graveyard synergies that recycle already played cards. This sort of engine then helps a deck scale into the late game to the point where it's nigh unstoppable. In the context of this sort of deck, removing opposing threats is important, but so is not removing opposing permanents, picking out the threats that can be left on board safely while the control deck spends its resources building value instead, while still dealing with the ones that are more immediately problematic. So this is my vision of control in EDH, and I think it's one that has a highly dynamic play pattern, both to pilot and to play against. The problem is, it's about as effective as a massive pile of board wipes. Wiping the board in a 4-player free-for-all format is just a really, really strong thing to do, and so a lot of players end up building these board wipe tribal monstrosities that constantly flush away all creatures or even all non-land permanents, thereby removing all the thinking of what permanents can be allowed to stick around for a bit. Can I honestly say these aren't control decks? No, I really can't. A dainty little Flicker Archeomancer pile is just as valid of a control deck in EDH as a board wipe pile. That's just how the format works. And board wipe pile doesn't even really refer to a specific set of goals or play patterns. It's just a thing a deck can do, playing a board wipe, cranked up to its limit and paired with whatever else a player might feel like doing that works in tandem with that. There are plenty more examples of this to be found. Whereas 60-card aggro decks have cutthroat optimized mana curves and very distinct play patterns, aggro decks in Commander are generally just mid-range decks that are stronger earlier in the game, such as the challenge of playing in a 3-opponent 40-life format. Some aggro decks can get around the 3-opponent issue by having most of their damage be ping-style effects, or get around the 40-life issue by using commander damage or infect, but basically none can dodge both of these challenges, and as a result, all of their speeds will be mediated by the need to punch harder and stick around longer. We can also think about classic archetypes that are borderline disallowed at most tables: Ponza, Prison, and Discard. In a cutthroat 1v1 format, these are fixtures, but in the social format of EDH, they're endlessly taboo. So this is the general point I'm trying to make here. The Commander format does not have distinct archetypes in the same way most other formats do. And actually, the phrase archetype has increasingly been phased out in the Commander player lexicon in favor of a different term: theme. I've kind of noticed this in some ways, but it's taken a handful of these run-ins with so-called archetypes to really cement things in my brain. In the year of our Lord 2026, Commander decks don't fit into dramatically different playstyles, but rather different flavors of existence. They have things that they do rather than things that they are. However, this observation demands a couple follow-up questions. For one, did Commander ever feature a lot of distinct archetypes? Was it once holy and pure, only now marred by a decade and a half of precon designs pushing decks in more generic directions? In my subjective experience, the answer is yes, but that's only because most of my pre-2023 Commander experience was playing with a group of 10 budget decks that me and my friends specifically designed to fit into different archetypes. Even there, the aggro, control, and combo decks felt a little mid-rangey compared to their 60-card counterparts, but there was still a distinctness that doesn't exist as much in Commander more broadly. Personally, I miss that differentiation a bit, but it's definitely a reflection of a cool micro format me and my friends built, more so than it is a reflection of how Commander used to be. At its inception in the 90s, EDH decks were janky and disjointed to the max, a collection of all the interesting and wacky cards that didn't quite fit into all of the 60-card decks of the day. Anybody who's played in a Chaos draft can tell you, when the cohesion of a card pool drops, the result is that deck plans get simpler and more generic. To be clear, this is a different style of generic than modern Commander decks. These days, decks tend to be stronger overall, featuring both a bit more cohesion and also a lot more card draw and other vegetables to hold things together. It's still a form of continuity, though. Commander decks have always been a bit more generic and a bit less cohesive than their 60-card counterparts. The second question worth asking is this fact good? Is the fact that Commander differs from 60-card formats in not having conventional archetypes a problem? For the most part, I would say no, it's not a problem. As I said, I enjoy when Commander decks are a bit more distinct from one another, when they fill different roles and peak in power at different points in the game. But Commander decks looking a lot like one another is very much something to be expected. In a 100-card singleton deck, there will be a natural limit to how specific a deck's game plan can be, and that will result in more shared attributes between decks. In a 4-player 40-life format, everything will be slower, and as a result, decks will be expected to grind at least into the mid-game. This also means that almost all decks will want card draw, ramp, and removal, unlike in 60-card formats where some decks are able to get away with little to none in one or more of these categories. Precons have certainly prodded Commander in a particular direction, but I don't think that direction represents anything aberrant or unexpected. Maybe if I grew up playing the super duper janky version of Commander, I'd be resenting the gentle power creep and gradual streamlining of precons, but I didn't, so I don't. The one part of this that is a little less ideal is the fact that non-Commander formats have become so secondary within the game. It's absolutely not a problem for a more casual format with less clearly differentiated decks to exist. But what about when it's the default? I remember back in the early to mid 2010s when Commander lived alongside other formats. Somebody who wanted to play Commander with their friends could do so, since most people had a Commander deck or two, but they also wouldn't have too hard a time finding somebody who wanted to play Standard or Modern or Pauper or even Kitchen Table 60-card Magic. Contrast that with now, where it feels like the average Magic player is more likely to have a 4th or 5th Commander deck than they are to have a 60-card deck put together and ready to play with, and they also probably aren't all that interested in playing in a draft. And just to be clear, there are absolutely reasons that Commander has succeeded to the extent it has, reasons that go beyond the outsized level of support it gets by Wizards of the Coast compared to other formats. It's great as a casual social format. It's just worth keeping in mind what we might be missing out on. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. Architect actually has an advanced search feature for the decks within it, and this includes colors, commander, inclusion of a specific card, and deck tags like themes or archetypes it fits. Want to see what various people consider to be a Reanimator deck, or dive into the various lists on Architect that feature the card Wild Research? This is your ticket. I also want to thank Dragon Shield for supporting the channel. If you want to pick up some of the awesome new Guild dual mats while also supporting the channel, you can follow the link in the description and use code SALUBRIOUS at checkout for 5% off. If you want to support the channel more directly, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. I'm currently taking submissions for my next deck review, and if you want a shot at getting your deck reviewed, becoming a supporter is your way of doing that.